The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton's firing range as Sergeant First Class Rebecca Martinez adjusted her rifle scope for the third time. The desert wind whispered across the North Carolina base, carrying with it the familiar scent of gunpowder and determination that had become her second nature over the past 8 years of military service. At 29, Rebecca had earned every stripe on her uniform through blood, sweat, and countless hours of training that would break most soldiers. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her steady brown eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. She had served 3 tours overseas, saved countless lives, and earned the respect of every unit she had worked with. But here, at this particular firing range, on this particular morning, none of that seemed to matter. Well, look what the cat dragged in, came the voice of Master Sergeant Jake Thompson, a towering man with a thick neck and an even thicker skull. He approached with his usual swagger, flanked by 2 other soldiers who seemed to feed off his every word like hungry dogs waiting for scraps. Rebecca didn't look up from her rifle. She had learned long ago that men like Thompson thrived on attention, positive or negative. "Morning, Thompson," she said evenly, her voice carrying no emotion. "I heard through the grapevine that you think you're some kind of hotshot sniper," Thompson continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "Heard you've been bragging about your little overseas adventures." This time Rebecca did look up, her eyes meeting his with the calm intensity of a predator sizing up prey. "I don't brag, Thompson, I just do my job." The truth was, Rebecca had never bragged about anything in her life. She had been raised by her grandmother in a small Texas town after her parents died in a car accident when she was 7. Maria Martinez had taught her granddaughter that actions spoke louder than words, and that respect was earned, not demanded. Those lessons had served Rebecca well throughout her military career, but they seemed to fall on deaf ears here at Fort Braxton. "Your job," Thompson laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the empty range. "Sweetheart, your job is whatever I say it is, and right now I'm thinking your job is to stop pretending you belong with the real soldiers." Corporal Danny Michel, one of Thompson's followers, chimed in with a snicker. "Yeah, maybe you should stick to the kitchen, Martinez. I bet you make a mean sandwich." The third man, Staff Sergeant Pete Williams, nodded in agreement. "Nothing wrong with knowing your place, girl. Some of us have been doing this since before you even thought about joining up." Rebecca felt the familiar burn of injustice in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced countless times throughout her career. It never got easier, this constant need to prove herself to men who had decided her worth before she ever had a chance to show it. But she had learned to channel that burn into fuel for her fire. "Is that right?" she said, standing slowly and shouldering her rifle. At 5'6" she was dwarfed by all 3 men, but something in her posture made them take an unconscious step back. "And what exactly do you think my place is?" Thompson's eyes narrowed. He could sense the challenge in her voice, and like all bullies, he couldn't resist taking the bait. Your place is wherever someone with real skills tells you it is. You want to prove you belong here. Let's see what you can do." He gestured toward the firing range, where targets were set up at various distances. The standard Army qualification targets were positioned at 300 yards, a distance that any competent soldier should be able to handle with ease. But Thompson's eyes gleamed with malice as he pointed to something much further out. "See that water tower way out there," he said, pointing to a structure that seemed to shimmer in the distance like a mirage. "That's 4,300 meters out, 4.3 kilometers of nothing but wind, heat, and impossible odds." Rebecca followed his gaze. The water tower was barely visible, a tiny speck on the horizon that most people would need binoculars to see clearly. It was an impossible shot by any standard, the kind of distance that even the most elite snipers would consider a miracle if they could hit. "You think you're such a hotshot," Thompson continued, his voice rising with excitement as he sensed what he thought would be an easy victory. "You think you're as good as any man on this base? Then prove it. Hit that water tower, and I'll personally recommend you for any assignment you want. Hell, I'll even apologize for doubting you." Mitchell and Williams exchanged glances, grinning like children who were about to watch someone else get in trouble. They had seen Thompson pull this routine before with other soldiers who had gotten too big for their britches. The impossible shot was his favorite way of putting people in their place. "And when you miss," Thompson added, his smile turning cruel, "when you miss, you admit that you don't belong here. You put in for a transfer to some nice safe desk job where you can't get real soldiers killed with your delusions of grandeur." Rebecca looked at the water tower again, calculating distance, wind speed, and a dozen other variables that would affect the shot. It was indeed impossible by conventional standards. The longest confirmed sniper kill in military history was just over 3,500 meters, and that had been achieved under perfect conditions with specialized equipment. This shot was 800 meters beyond that, in desert conditions with standard Army-issue gear. But Rebecca Martinez had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially not from a bully who thought her gender made her weak. She thought about her grandmother, who had raised 5 children while working 2 jobs and never once complained about the unfairness of life. She thought about the soldiers she had served with overseas, men and women who had trusted her with their lives and never questioned her ability to keep them safe. "What's the matter, Martinez?" Thompson taunted. "Getting cold feet. Maybe you're finally realizing that this isn't some game." Rebecca turned to face him, her decision made. "I'll take your bet, Thompson, but let's make it interesting." The surprise on his face was almost worth the risk she was about to take. "What did you have in mind?" "If I make this shot," she said, her voice steady and calm, "you don't just apologize. You admit, in front of the entire unit, that you were wrong about me. You acknowledge that I belong here just as much as any other soldier." Thompson's grin returned full force. He was confident that he was about to humiliate her in front of anyone who might be watching. "And when you miss—" "If I miss," Rebecca said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth, "I'll request a transfer, but not to a desk job. I'll transfer out of Special Forces entirely." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Mitchell and Williams seemed stunned by the magnitude of what she was proposing. To leave Special Forces would mean giving up everything she had worked for, everything that defined her as a soldier. Thompson extended his hand, his grip firm and sweaty when she shook it. "You've got yourself a deal, Martinez. When do you want to embarrass yourself?" Rebecca shouldered her rifle and began walking toward the firing line. No time like the present. As word spread quickly through the base about the impossible challenge, soldiers began gathering around the firing range. Some came to watch what they expected to be a spectacular failure. Others came because they had heard whispers about Rebecca's reputation and wanted to see if the stories were true. Rebecca knelt at the firing line, her rifle resting on a bipod as she began the careful process of calculating her shot. She closed her eyes and let her training take over, remembering everything she had learned about long-distance shooting from her instructors and from hard experience in the field. The wind was variable, gusting between 8 and 12 miles per hour from the southwest. The temperature was rising as the sun climbed higher, which would affect bullet trajectory. The humidity was low, another factor to consider. And then, there was the sheer distance involved. A shot that would test every limit of both her equipment and her skill. She thought about Thompson's smug face, about the way he and his followers treated anyone they considered beneath them. She thought about all the times she had been underestimated, all the battles she had fought just to be taken seriously as a soldier. But mostly, she thought about the shot itself, because in the end, that's all that mattered. Not the politics, not the personalities, not the unfairness of having to prove herself over and over again, just the rifle in her hands, the target in the distance, and the skills she had spent years developing. Rebecca opened her eyes and peered through her scope, making minute adjustments to account for every variable she could think of. The water tower swam into focus, still impossibly small and distant, but now clearly visible through her optics. Behind her, she could hear Thompson making jokes to his friends, already celebrating what he considered to be his inevitable victory. The gathered crowd was growing larger, and she could feel their eyes on her back like a physical weight. She took a deep breath, held it, and prepared to take a shot that would change everything. As Rebecca settled into her shooting position, memories flooded back to her like scenes from an old movie. She remembered the first time she had picked up a rifle, not in the army, but as a 12-year-old girl in the Texas hills behind her grandmother's house. Maria Martinez had been a woman of few words but infinite wisdom. When young Rebecca had come home crying because the boys at school said girls couldn't shoot, her grandmother had simply taken her old hunting rifle down from the wall. "Mia," she had said in her gentle but firm voice, "let me tell you something about shooting. It's not about how strong you are or how loud you can yell. It's about patience, discipline, and respect for the weapon in your hands. Some of the best hunters I've ever known were women." That afternoon, Maria had taught Rebecca the fundamentals of marksmanship: how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it, how to become one with the rifle until it felt like an extension of her own body. By the time the sun set that day, Rebecca was hitting tin cans at 100 yards with startling consistency. "You have a gift, Mia," her grandmother had said, pride evident in her weathered face. But remember, with any gift comes responsibility. You use this skill to protect what matters, never to harm what doesn't deserve it. Those words had guided Rebecca through her entire military career, through basic training, where drill sergeants had initially dismissed her as just another pretty face who would wash out within weeks, through sniper school, where she had been one of only 3 women in a class of 47 and the only one to graduate, through her first deployment to Afghanistan, where her skills had saved the lives of countless soldiers and civilians. Now, as she lay on the firing line at Fort Braxton with Thompson's mocking laughter echoing behind her, those same words rang in her ears. This shot wasn't about proving herself to a bully. It was about protecting what mattered, her integrity, her career, and the respect she had earned through 8 years of faithful service. The crowd behind her had grown to include nearly 100 soldiers, word having spread through the base like wildfire. She could hear whispered conversations, some supportive, others skeptical. Most seemed to think she was crazy for even attempting such an impossible shot. "I heard she's actually pretty good," one voice said. "Good doesn't matter at this distance," came the reply. "This is beyond good. This is miracle territory." Rebecca tried to block out the noise and focus on her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, steady and controlled. She had learned long ago that the mental game was just as important as the physical one when it came to precision shooting. Through her scope, she studied the water tower with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. The structure was old, probably built in the 1960s, with a cylindrical tank perched on 4 steel legs. Someone had painted Fort Braxton in large black letters across the side facing the base. And it was those letters that would serve as her target. At 4,300 meters. Even the largest letters appeared tiny through her scope. She would need to account for bullet drop of nearly 30 feet at that distance, assuming her calculations were correct. The bullet would take almost 6 seconds to reach the target. Plenty of time for wind conditions to change multiple times during its flight. She made her first adjustment to the scope, dialing in what she hoped would be the correct elevation. The rifle she was using was a standard M24 sniper weapon system, reliable but not designed for shots at this extreme range. Most military snipers would consider 800 meters to be a long shot with this weapon. What she was attempting was 5 times that distance. "This is taking forever," she heard Thompson complain loudly. "Maybe she's finally realized how stupid this is." Rebecca ignored him and continued her calculations. Wind speed at the shooting position was one thing, but she also had to consider what the wind might be doing at various points along the bullets. Paths. She looked for signs in the distance, dust patterns, the way heat waves shimmered, anything that might give her a clue about wind conditions, downrange. The truth was, she had made shots at extreme distances before, but never in front of an audience and never with so much riding on the outcome. During her second tour in Afghanistan, she had successfully engaged targets at over 2,000 meters on multiple occasions, shots that had broken up insurgent attacks and saved American lives. But those had been combat situations where she had time to study the target area, where she could take multiple shots if necessary to get the range right. This was different. This was one shot, one chance. With her entire career hanging in the balance, she thought about the men she had served with overseas. Soldiers who had trusted her implicitly and never questioned her ability based on her gender. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, who had nicknamed her Angel after she had saved his patrol from a sniper attack. Lieutenant Colonel James Washington, who had personally recommended her for the Bronze Star after she had held off an enemy assault single-handedly. For 4 hours, those men had judged her by her actions, not by their preconceived notions about what a woman could or couldn't do. They had seen her in combat, had watched her perform under pressure, and had given her the respect she had earned. But here at Fort Braxton, surrounded by soldiers who had never heard a shot fired in anger, she was once again having to prove her worth to men who had already decided she didn't belong. The irony wasn't lost on her. Thompson, for all his bluster and bravado, had never deployed overseas. His entire military career had been spent stateside, training other soldiers and building his reputation as a range bully. Mitchell and Williams were cut from the same cloth, big fish in a small pond who had never been tested in the crucible of actual combat, yet here they were, questioning the abilities of someone who had risked her life for her country on multiple occasions. It was enough to make her angry, but Rebecca had learned to channel anger into focus. Anger could make your hand shake, could throw off your breathing, could turn a makeable shot into an embarrassing miss. She made another adjustment to her scope, this time for windage. The breeze had picked up slightly, and she could see dust devils forming in the distance between her position and the water tower. The wind was going to be the biggest challenge, more so than the distance itself. "Come on, Martinez," Thompson called out, his voice carrying clearly across the range. "We don't have all day. Some of us have real work to do." This time, Rebecca turned to look at him. The crowd had formed a rough semicircle behind the firing line, and Thompson stood at the center like a ringmaster at a circus. His arms were crossed, and his expression was one of smug superiority, as if he had already won the bet. "Real work?" Rebecca asked, her voice calm but carrying clearly enough for everyone to hear. "You mean like the real work I did in Kandahar when I eliminated 7 enemy combatants in a single engagement? Or maybe you're talking about the real work I did in Helmand Province when I provided overwatch for a medevac extraction under fire?" Thompson's expression faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "That's ancient history, sweetheart. This is here and now." "You're right," Rebecca agreed, turning back to her rifle. "This is here and now. And here and now, I'm about to show you what 8 years of real work looks like." She settled back into her shooting position, feeling the familiar comfort of the rifle stock against her cheek. The weapon had become an extension of herself, as natural as breathing or walking. She had fired thousands of rounds through similar rifles, had learned every quirk and characteristic of the platform. Through her scope, she made one final study of the target area. The water tower stood like a sentinel against the pale blue sky, its black letters beginning to waver slightly in the heat rising from the desert floor. In a few hours, when the sun reached its peak, the mirage effect would make such a shot impossible. But now, in the relative cool of the morning, she had a chance. She thought about her grandmother one more time, remembering the pride in the old woman's eyes the day Rebecca had graduated from sniper school. Maria Martinez had lived to see her granddaughter become everything she had dreamed of. A strong woman who could stand toe-to-toe with anyone and never back down from a challenge. "This one's for you, Abuela," Rebecca whispered, too quietly for anyone else to hear. She took a deep breath, let half of it out, and began to apply pressure to the trigger. Years of training had taught her to squeeze straight back, using the pad of her index finger rather than the joint, applying steady pressure until the rifle fired almost as a surprise. The shot would either make her career or end it. There was no middle ground, no participation trophy for coming close. In the unforgiving world of precision shooting, you either hit your target or you didn't. Behind her, the crowd fell silent as they realized the moment of truth had arrived. Even Thompson stopped his running commentary, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what was about to happen. Rebecca felt her heart beat slow, felt time stretch out like taffy as her finger continued its steady pressure on the trigger. This was the moment that would define not just her day, but possibly her entire future in the military. The rifle was steady, her breathing controlled, her mind clear of all distractions. She was as ready as she would ever be. The morning seemed to hold its breath as Rebecca's finger reached the breaking point on the trigger. Years of training had taught her to find that perfect moment between heartbeats, between breaths, when her body was as still as humanly possible. She had reached that moment now, balanced on the edge of what seemed impossible. The M24 rifle bucked against her shoulder with familiar authority, the sound of the shot echoing across the desert like thunder. The .308 Winchester round left the barrel at nearly 2,700 feet per second, beginning its long journey through the shimmering air toward a target that seemed impossibly far away. Behind her, the crowd of soldiers seemed frozen in time, 100 pairs of eyes strained to see downrange. But at 4,300 meters, it would be nearly 6 seconds before the bullet reached its destination. 6 seconds that felt like 6 hours to everyone watching. Rebecca remained in position, her eye still pressed to the scope, following the bullet's theoretical path toward the water tower. She had done everything right. Her calculations were sound, her form was perfect, her equipment was functioning flawlessly. But at this distance, there were so many variables beyond her control that even a perfect shot could miss by yards. The wind, which had been relatively steady when she pulled the trigger, seemed to shift just slightly as the bullet flew downrange. A dust devil formed and dissipated in the space between the firing line and the target. The temperature continued to rise as the sun climbed higher, creating heat waves that could deflect the bullet's path. Did she hit it? Someone in the crowd whispered. "Can't tell from here," came the reply. "Too far to see." Thompson stood with his arms crossed, that smug smile still plastered on his face. He was so confident in the impossibility of the shot that he hadn't even bothered to bring binoculars to watch for the impact. In his mind, this was just a formality before he could claim his victory and watch Rebecca Martinez slink away in defeat. Major Patricia Collins, the base's executive officer, had been alerted to the spectacle and had arrived just in time to witness the shot. Unlike Thompson, she had come prepared with high-powered binoculars and was scanning the distant water tower intently. The seconds stretched on. 3.4.5. Then, at precisely the moment Rebecca's calculations had predicted, a small puff of dust and debris erupted from the base of the water tower. It was barely visible to the naked eye, just a tiny cloud that appeared and disappeared in an instant. Major Collins lowered her binoculars, her expression one of complete amazement. "I'll be damned," she said quietly. "What?" Thompson demanded, his confident demeanor beginning to crack. "What did you see?" But before Collins could answer, the sharp crack of the bullet's supersonic passage finally reached them, followed a moment later by the distant echo of impact. The sound rolled across the desert like delayed thunder, confirming what the Major had seen through her binoculars. "She hit it," Collins announced, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent range, dead center of the B in Braxton. Crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers, gasps, and stunned silence. Soldiers who had been certain they were about to witness an embarrassing failure instead found themselves witnessing military history. Some began applauding, others just stood there shaking their heads in disbelief. Rebecca slowly rose from her shooting position, her movements careful and deliberate. She had felt the shot the moment it left the barrel, felt it in that indefinable way that all precision shooters recognize. It had been perfect, or as close to perfect as humanly possible, but hearing the confirmation still sent a wave of relief and satisfaction washing over her. Thompson's face had gone pale, his mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. The bet he had been so confident of winning had just blown up in his face in the most spectacular way possible. Worse than that, he was now obligated to fulfill his end of the bargain, to apologize publicly and admit he had been wrong about Rebecca's abilities. That's impossible," he stammered, looking from Rebecca to the distant water tower and back again. "Nobody can make that shot. Nobody." "Apparently, somebody can," Major Collins interjected, her tone making it clear that she was not amused by Thompson's poor sportsmanship. "In fact, unless I'm mistaken, Sergeant Martinez just set a new base record, possibly a new Army record." The Major was right. Rebecca's shot had exceeded the longest confirmed sniper kill in military history by nearly 800 meters. It was the kind of achievement that would be talked about for years, the kind of shot that enters military legend. But for Rebecca, the distance record was secondary to the personal victory. She had silenced the doubters, proven her worth, and earned the respect that should have been hers from the beginning. More importantly, she had shown every other woman on the base that they didn't have to accept being underestimated or dismissed. "I believe you owe Sergeant Martinez an apology," Major Collins said to Thompson, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command authority. "In fact, I believe you owe her more than that, based on what I've been hearing about the terms of your little wager." Thompson looked around desperately, as if hoping to find some escape from the situation he had created. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. 100 witnesses had heard him make the bet, and military protocol demanded that he honor his word. He began, then stopped, clearly struggling with what he had to say. For a man who had built his reputation on being the alpha dog of the firing range, this public humiliation was devastating. Rebecca watched him struggle, feeling no satisfaction in his obvious discomfort. She had never wanted to humiliate anyone. She had simply wanted to be treated with the respect she had earned. But Thompson had forced this confrontation, had made it about gender rather than ability, and now he had to face the consequences. "Well," Major Collins prompted, "we're all waiting." Thompson's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he finally found his voice. I was wrong," he said, the words coming out like they physically hurt him. "I was wrong about Sergeant Martinez. She clearly belongs here as much as anyone." "Louder," Collins ordered. "I don't think everyone heard that." Thompson's face reddened, but he raised his voice. "I said I was wrong. Sergeant Martinez has proven that she belongs in Special Forces, and I apologize for suggesting otherwise." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Some soldiers nodded approvingly, others simply looked relieved that the tension was finally broken, but Rebecca noticed that not everyone seemed pleased with the outcome. Mitchell and Williams still looked sullen and resentful, as if their worldview had been challenged in a way that made them uncomfortable. Major Collins turned to Rebecca, extending her hand with a genuine smile. "Congratulations, Sergeant. That was extraordinary shooting under extraordinary pressure." I'd like to discuss this achievement with you privately when you have a moment. Rebecca shook the major's hand, feeling the firm grip of mutual respect. Thank you, ma'am. I'm available at your convenience. As the crowd began to disperse, soldiers approached Rebecca individually to offer their congratulations. Some seemed genuinely impressed by what they had witnessed. Others appeared to be calculating how this might affect their own standing on the base. But all of them, even the skeptics, now looked at her with a new level of respect. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, one of the few other women in the unit, was among the first to congratulate her. "Girl, that was amazing," she said with a huge grin. "I've been waiting years for someone to put Thompson in his place." "I didn't do it to put anyone in their place," Rebecca replied honestly. "I did it because it needed to be done." "Same difference," Gonzalez laughed. "Either way, you just made life a whole lot easier for every woman on the space." As Rebecca packed up her rifle and gear, she reflected on what had just happened. In 6 seconds, a single bullet had traveled 4,300 meters and changed everything. It had silenced the doubters, earned her the respect she deserved, and sent a clear message that ability knew no gender. But she also knew that this victory, as satisfying as it was, wouldn't solve all her problems. There would always be more Thompsons, more men who needed to be convinced that women could be just as capable as soldiers. The shot she had just made would become legend, but legends had a way of being dismissed or explained away by those who didn't want to believe them. Still, as she walked off the firing range with her head held high, Rebecca Martinez felt something she hadn't felt in a long time at Fort Braxton. She felt like she truly belonged. And sometimes that feeling was worth more than all the records and accolades in the world. The shot had been heard around the base, literally and figuratively. Now it was time to see what kind of changes it would bring. Word of Rebecca's impossible shot spread through Fort Braxton like wildfire. By evening, soldiers who hadn't even been on base that morning were talking about the female sniper who had hit a target at over 4 kilometers. The story grew with each telling, as military stories tend to do, but the core facts remained unchanged. Sergeant First Class Rebecca Martinez had accomplished something that most experts would have considered impossible. In the officers' club that night, the conversation at every table seemed to center on the morning's events. Some called it the greatest display of marksmanship they had ever witnessed. Others wondered aloud if the shot had been a fluke, a lucky accident that would never be repeated. But all agreed that it would be remembered for years to come. Major Patricia Collins sat in her office, reviewing Rebecca's service record with new eyes. She had always known Martinez was a capable soldier. Her performance evaluations and combat decorations made that clear, but today's demonstration had revealed something extraordinary. Collins was beginning to understand why Rebecca had been so frustrated with her treatment at Fort Braxton. The service record painted a picture of a soldier who had consistently exceeded expectations. 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and numerous commendations for valor and marksmanship. Rebecca had served with distinction in some of the most dangerous areas of Afghanistan, earning the respect and admiration of every unit she had worked with. Yet somehow, at Fort Braxton, she had been treated as little more than a novelty, the token female in special forces who was tolerated rather than respected. Collins realized that this wasn't just an injustice to Rebecca personally, it was a failure of leadership that reflected poorly on the entire base. Meanwhile, in the enlisted barracks, the reaction to Rebecca's achievement was mixed. Many soldiers were genuinely impressed and saw her success as a victory for the entire unit. But others, particularly those who had aligned themselves with Thompson's way of thinking, were less enthusiastic. Corporal Danny Mitchell sat on his bunk, still trying to process what he had witnessed. He had been so certain that Rebecca would fail, so confident that Thompson's worldview was correct, that seeing her succeed had shaken something fundamental in his beliefs. "I still can't believe she made that shot," he said to his roommate, Private First Class Tony Rodriguez. "I mean, what are the odds?" Rodriguez, who had served overseas and had more respect for combat veterans regardless of gender, shook his head. "The odds don't matter, Danny. What matters is that she did it. And honestly, after hearing some of the stories about what she did in Afghanistan, I'm not that surprised." "What stories?" Mitchell asked, his curiosity overcoming his skepticism. Rodriguez pulled out his phone and showed Mitchell an article from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. The headline read, "Female Sniper Saves Platoon in Kandahar Province." The article detailed how Rebecca had single-handedly held off an insurgent attack for 4 hours, allowing a trapped American patrol to be evacuated. "There's more," Rodriguez said, scrolling through his phone. Look at this one Army sniper credited with 47 confirmed kills. And this one female soldier receives Bronze Star for heroism under fire. Mitchell read the articles in silence, his worldview crumbling with each paragraph. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified had a combat record that put most Special Forces soldiers to shame. She had literally been saving American lives while he was still in high school. Why didn't anyone tell us about this stuff? He asked. Quietly, maybe because nobody bothered to ask, Rodriguez replied. Maybe because some people were too busy assuming she didn't belong here to actually look at her record. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Staff Sergeant Pete Williams, who had been notably absent since the morning's events. Williams had always been Thompson's most loyal follower, but even he seemed shaken by what had happened. "Did you guys hear?" Williams said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Major Collins is launching an investigation into the treatment of female soldiers on base. Apparently, she's been getting complaints for months, but today's incident was the final straw." Mitchell felt a chill run down his spine. He had participated in plenty of the casual harassment and dismissive behavior that had been directed at Rebecca and other female soldiers. If there really was going to be an investigation, he could find himself in serious trouble. "What kind of investigation?" Rodriguez asked. "The kind that could end careers," Williams replied grimly. "Collins is reportedly furious about the way Martinez has been treated. She's talking about filing formal complaints against Thompson and anyone else who contributed to creating a hostile work environment." In her own quarters, Rebecca was trying to process the day's events while fielding a constant stream of phone calls and text messages. Word of her achievement had spread beyond Fort Braxton, reaching former colleagues and commanders who had served with her overseas. Lieutenant Colonel James Washington, her former commanding officer in Afghanistan, called to congratulate her. "I heard about your little demonstration today," he said with obvious pride in his voice. 4,300 meters. "Rebecca, that's incredible, even for you." "Thank you, sir," Rebecca replied. "It felt good to remind people what I'm capable of." "You shouldn't have to remind anyone," Washington said, his tone turning serious. "Your record speaks for itself. Anyone who questions your abilities is either ignorant or choosing to ignore the facts." The conversation turned to Rebecca's current situation at Fort Braxton, and Washington was clearly troubled by what he heard. "This Thompson character sounds like a real piece of work," he said. "Have you considered filing a formal complaint?" "I've thought about it," Rebecca admitted. "But you know how these things go. Even when complaints are upheld, the complainant often faces retaliation. I've been trying to handle it through unofficial channels." "Well, after today, you might not have to worry about unofficial channels," Washington said. "A shot like that doesn't just impress people, it makes them pay attention. And once people are paying attention, it becomes harder for the bad actors to operate in the shadows." As if to prove his point, Rebecca's phone buzzed with another call as soon as she hung up with Washington. This time it was Major Collins, asking if she could come to the administration building for a private conversation. 20 minutes later, Rebecca found herself sitting across from Collins in the Major's office, surprised by the warmth and respect in the senior officer's demeanor. It was a far cry from the cool professionalism she had grown accustomed to at Fort Braxton. "Sergeant Martinez," Collins began, "I want to start by apologizing. What happened this morning should never have been necessary. The fact that you felt compelled to prove yourself in such a dramatic fashion tells me that we've failed you as a command structure." Rebecca was taken aback by the directness of the apology. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. I've been reviewing your service record," Collins continued, "and frankly, I'm embarrassed by how you've been treated here. Your combat experience and achievements should have earned you immediate respect from every soldier on this base. Instead, it seems like you've been subjected to a pattern of harassment and discrimination." The Major opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. "I've been receiving informal complaints about the command climate here for months, but I didn't fully appreciate the scope of